Last week, I published an interview for my podcast series, Behind the Grind, and the guest of that interview was Trevor Miller, board chair of MAPS Canada and the founder of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. I was especially excited about that interview because I know some of you guys have expressed an interest in microdosing and in medicinal psychedelics in general. So I was so baffled then. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll know what happened. 5 seconds after I released that video, I got an instant dislike and a disapproving comment from, I guess, one of my subscribers. What bothered me wasn't the fact that I got a dislike on my video or a negative comment. It was the fact that it seemed like I got it from somebody who, before even watching the video itself and understanding why we felt it was important to release such content, especially in this day and age, the person simply resorted to their pre-existing bias against recreational drugs as a moral philosophy. As unfortunate as that incident was, it sort of got me thinking, and it inspired me to make this video today. Some of you have, especially if you've been following since the very beginning, from my first video 3 months ago, you know bits and pieces of my story. But today I wanted to share another piece of my story that'll hopefully help you understand why I've become so passionate about holistic treatments to mental health issues. In a different life, I had my own small business. I ran a marketing agency for almost 4 years between 2015 and 2019. At its peak, I had about 6 people working for me on payroll. You know, I was young, I was ambitious, I had ideas, and for the most part, I enjoyed the work, but there was another side to that kind of work, especially after we started growing so quickly, so fast, the pressure to maintain what I had built. A lot of that pressure fell on me, of course, as the CEO of the company, the person bringing in contracts and the person sort of laying out the groundwork for our clients. In July 2017, I started noticing that I was finding it difficult to get out of bed. And I started noticing that I was living with so much anxiety that even small tasks like going to the grocery store or being seen out and about, aside from having to be at work, it was a battle for me. Being no stranger to depression and anxiety, because I've had a history of such, I immediately recognized those symptoms to be symptoms of depression and anxiety. So I went to see my doctor and he prescribed me Effexor. And this is a drug that I'd already been on once before in my younger years. And coming off this antidepressant was not fun at all for me. I knew what Effexor could do, and I knew how coming off it would be a terrible experience. But at this point, I was willing to try anything, including an antidepressant that I had already tried before. I asked my doctor to give me the lowest dose possible, which is 37.5 milligrams. So that's what we did. For a while, being on this dose worked. I was able to get back to normal and I was able to function. But about 5 months later, in January 2008, the depression and anxiety came back and I was again back in my doctor's office. And this time he suggested that I up my dose to 75 milligrams, which to most people was a standard dose. Again, feeling the pressures of my business and seeing as I needed a solution pronto, I agreed to have my dosage bumped up to 75 milligrams. And for a while, once again, it worked and I was able to function normally and go about my life as an entrepreneur. Then April 2008 came. And I remember this because it marked the beginning of the single most turbulent year of my business. We had gone from a 50% year-over-year top-line revenue growth to all of a sudden 2 big contracts that I had bet on didn't pull through. My co-founder, I found out she was pregnant. And then within the same 2-week period, we found out that our marketing lead, someone whom we had spent the last 2 years investing in and training, our marketing lead got poached by another company. So this was a lot of stress for me for so many reasons. Having the entrepreneur mentality at the time, I was determined not to let this series of unfortunate events get the better of me. I decided to put my head down and hustle harder than I've ever hustled before. But before doing so, one of the things that I did was I went back to my doctor and told him once again of the symptoms that I had been experiencing and symptoms that I refused to live with. He suggested that I bump up my antidepressants to 150 milligrams, which would be double the dose that I had been on before. I said yes. And for a while, I felt like the antidepressants helped. I was able to function. I was able to put my head down, and I was able to do what I needed to do as an entrepreneur in survival mode. By October 2009, I brought in a number of wins that we could celebrate. We had a new all-star member to the team. We were working on, contracts that could sustain us again. My co-founder left for maternity leave, and it felt like the coast was clear. Only I had completely burnt out. I was a shell of a human being at this point. I don't know what it was, but when the proposition of going back to normal came, I didn't want to take it. I didn't feel anything for it. I didn't feel passionate about my marketing agency anymore and doing the work that I had been doing. This thing that I had spent so much time building, I felt nothing of it. And all I can remember was seeing everybody on my team go about their lives and moving on with their lives, starting families, starting new jobs, going on vacations. And yet I was the person there watching them, watching it all go by, sort of just peering through a window from a room that I couldn't leave. That was the moment I decided that that work wasn't for me. And by then I physically, had lost 20 pounds. Under the stress. I wasn't working out. I wasn't eating properly. I was so physically, mentally, and emotionally weak, and I couldn't take it anymore. So I made the call to close my marketing agency, and we transitioned people out. And by January 2019, we moved the last of our furniture out, and I closed the last great chapter of my life. 2019 was the year I learned to slow down for the first time in my life. I shifted my focus back on healing myself, getting my full night's sleep, exercising, eating right, reading all the books that I had always wanted to read but never had time for. I knew that I couldn't have an indefinite amount of time to just be figuring myself out because I lived in the real world after all. But I knew I had a little bit of time, so I didn't want to squander that time. What I felt was so weird was, this whole time I'm still on my antidepressants, 150 milligrams of Effexor. For the most part, I didn't think much of it until I had a realization in April when I looked back on the last 2 years of my life, and I knew on paper so many things had happened, so many changes had happened, but yet emotionally I felt like nothing provoked any feelings in me. And I looked back as if I had existed through the events of my life of the last 2 years, but I didn't live through them. It was as if I had spent the last 2 years merely existing for other people and for external circumstances and not living for myself. And I don't know how to describe it any other way, but I was certain it was the antidepressants. And you know what? What antidepressants do is that they take your normal range of emotion. So let's say it's like this, and then they narrow that range. And so when you are going through a crisis, when you are in a trough, an emotional trough, they can be helpful because they can bring that emotional trough and sort of raise it a little bit so that you feel like it's more manageable. But long term, and this is what I felt intuitively at the time, but it turns out there are studies to suggest this, and there are thought leaders, there are more holistically minded psychiatrists will vouch that most of the benefits of antidepressants are shown in short-term studies and not necessarily long-term studies. It seems to be that antidepressants has an effect of blunting your emotions in the long run, and whether that's good or bad, the only thing I can say is that based on my own experience, it felt like I had gotten to the point where the antidepressants were sort of robbing me of my livelihood. So March of last year, I went back to my doctor and I told him I was ready to begin tapering off my antidepressants. He recommended a tapering schedule for me. And knowing my previous experience of coming off Effexor years ago, I said to him, I insisted that I want the regular schedule that he was ready to put me on, and I wanted him to taper it out even more. He obliged. At the time, I felt good about the schedule that I was on. I felt that it was going to allow my body enough time to adjust to a new chemical normal. In May of 2019, I took my last dose of Effexor, and I braced myself for a short period of withdrawal symptoms. Because I had been here before, I knew cognitively what to expect. And for the most part, what ended up happening was 2 weeks of brain zaps, agitation, anxiety, so nothing out of the ordinary. Once I got through it, I thought I was in the clear. This is the part that I didn't expect. It ended up baffling my primary care physician that he didn't even immediately trace the experience back to the antidepressants. But what had happened after the last of my brain zaps was a 2-week grace period where I thought I had gone back to normal. But then after that, I started getting migraines. And if anybody has ever gotten a migraine, you will know that it's not just a more intense version of a headache. A migraine, it's a cluster of neurological symptoms that can be debilitating. So you're hypersensitive to light and sound. The pain is unlike any headache that you've ever had before. I just kept getting migraines every single day. There was vomiting, there was nausea, there was so much pain that the only relief that I found was laying my head on the pillow. I went to see my primary care physician numerous times. He prescribed me several medications. Nothing worked. I went to the hospital twice. I ended up living like this for a straight month. For a straight month, I couldn't get anything done. I didn't see my friends. I was essentially debilitated. And then I started researching online, and I wondered if, because I'd never had migraines before, I wondered if all the symptoms that I was experiencing could be ascribed to the fact that I had recently tapered off my antidepressants. I went online, I lurked on forums, and I read other people's experiences, especially people who had taken Effexor, and they reported very similar experiences. Some had reported that their withdrawal symptoms were so bad they ended up just going back on the antidepressants. Some had compared the antidepressant withdrawal to opioid withdrawal. I was mortified because this was nothing that anybody told me about. This was nothing like anything I'd ever experienced. When you go through depression and you're in your doctor's office and you're talking about being put on an antidepressant, this is stuff that they don't tell you. My doctor didn't even know that antidepressant withdrawal, Effexor withdrawal, could lead to the symptoms that I had been experiencing. How I knew that my month-long experience of having daily migraines could be ascribed to my antidepressant withdrawal was that once I finally got better, I immediately signed up for a private care clinic. For those of you who don't know, I live in Canada, and here we have universal healthcare, which is great. I am so grateful for that. But it has its pros and cons. For the most part, it has more pros than cons, which is why I'm very happy for it. But I had gotten to the point where I felt like my primary care physician wasn't giving me the quality of care that I needed for the specific problem that I had. So I paid $5,000 at a private care clinic where they did top to bottom tests on me. And I could meet with a new family physician who could spend all the time with me in the world. And she confirmed that my month-long experience of having migraines was the result of tapering off my antidepressants. It's been a year now since all of that happened, and I have not been back on antidepressants since. Knowing myself and knowing my history, I feel like I'm perhaps more prone to symptoms of depression and anxiety than other people are. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the future I found myself experiencing similar symptoms. At this point, I don't feel like I ever want to go back on antidepressants. And maybe that's a topic I can parse out in another video, but it was the fact that for me, antidepressants were so easy to get on and so difficult to get off. And the fact that I knew that even as somebody who is more prone to depression, there are more drawbacks to staying on depression medication long-term than there are benefits. I don't feel like it's my place to make a claim about antidepressants. I'm simply sharing my experience here. But I guess this kind of explains why I am so passionate about plant medicine and so passionate about promoting the effects of plant medicine here on this channel. It's because I look back on what I went through, and it's not lost on me the amount of privilege I had to just be able to suffer through a month of daily migraines and to give myself permission to bear through it, hoping that I would get to the point where my body could adjust to a new normal. I know most people have jobs to go to and bills to pay, and for a lot of people, and I've since learned through the discussions that I've had with people, most people choose to just stay on their antidepressants as opposed to dealing with the withdrawal symptoms. Basically, that's all I wanted to make this video today to talk to you about. Was I wanted to open up about my experience on antidepressants and my experience coming off them. And hopefully this will give you more perspective about why I am passionate about the topics that I'm passionate about here on this channel. I hope this place can continue to be a judgment-free zone where we can open up about our experiences, because The last statistic I read about Americans on antidepressants is that 11% of Americans are on antidepressants. Over quarantine, so February to March, that number increased by almost 20%. So that's a lot of people on antidepressants. Again, I'm not criticizing antidepressants as a resource and as a tool for the people who are suffering and going through crisis situations, very low points in their lives. But we need to be having more holistic conversations about antidepressants so that every single one of us can make the best choice for ourselves, regardless of what that choice might be. Thank you so much for sitting with me through this video. I would be curious to learn about your personal experiences if you're open to sharing them in the comment section below. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it. I will see you in my next video.